This is the first mallet I've ever made. It gets the job done, but like everyone's first mallet, it could be better. It's been about 2 years since I made it, and it's time for a big upgrade. But if you know me, I didn't want any plain old mallet. I wanted the most epic mallet ever created by man. So in this video, I used some rare exotic wood and brass epoxy to make this extremely over-the-top wood hammer. Since a mallet is used for whacking things, I decided to get some African black ebony wood, which is actually one of the densest and hardest woods in the world. It's very expensive, so I thought I could kind of outsmart the system a little bit, and I ordered a 15-pound box of scrap ebony that I could use for this mallet. I figured there would at least be a few pieces of usable stock in there that I could use for the head, but I think I was a bit too hopeful. The wood that came in the box was pretty much scrap junk, and I mean, that's literally what I ordered, so I'm not exactly sure what I was expecting. Anyways, there was just enough salvageable pieces that I could throw together to make each side of the head of the mallet. I'm going to have to glue each of the pieces together, which is kind of less than ideal, but we're going to make it work. So once I got enough pieces scrounged together, I could get them ready to glue up. It was kind of hard to get each piece perfectly jointed, so I used some sandpaper to get a perfectly flat edge on each piece, and it actually worked really well. Since the head of the mallet was not going to be a solid piece of wood, I was a little bit worried that you were going to be able to see the glue lines where I joined each piece together. Luckily, the wood glue I used did a really good job at seamlessly joining all the gaps, and you can't really see any glue lines at all. So like I said, black ebony or African ebony or Gaboon ebony or whatever the heck you want to call it is actually one of the hardest woods in the world. For those that don't know, they actually have a scale to measure the hardness of a wood species, and it's called the Janka hardness test. Most of your typical domestic hardwoods like maple or walnut ranks between 1,000 and 1,500. Softwoods like pine come in at a little bit over 500, but Gaboon ebony actually ranks at 3,200, which makes it almost 2 times harder than maple, which is actually pretty impressive. To get these two pieces flat, I had to get a little creative. They were too short to send them through my planer, so I had to make a quick little sled for my drum sander. I used some CA glue to temporarily attach the pieces, and I also added a waste piece of oak on each side to eliminate any snipe that might happen. People who are new to woodworking might be asking, what is even the point of making a wood hammer in the first place? And that's a fair question. In this case, a wood mallet is usually used alongside of chisels or other hand tools, and the wood mallet just helps to keep your other metal tools in good shape. If you were to use, say, like a framing hammer, you'd pretty quickly destroy your nice chisels, so a wood hammer is great for that. To be honest, they're pretty fun to build too. It's a great project for some beginners to learn some new techniques, plus they just kind of look cool. Once each of the outer pieces are done and squared up, I can cut out the inner pieces that will hold the handle in place. I cut roughly a 5-degree angle on the bandsaw that will allow the handle to be wedged into place later on, and this will probably make a little bit more sense later in the video. Once that piece is sanded up, I can get ready to glue the mallet head together. This glue up is pretty simple. I just stack the pieces together like a sandwich. I had a little bit of issues with the pieces kind of sliding around, but once I got a few clamps on, that pretty much went away. Once that was dry, I got it out of the clamps and began to square it up. Now, I got a little ambitious here, trying to trim the top in one single pass, so I lowered the blade a bit and made multiple passes. I really wasn't too interested in trying to lose any of my fingers that day, so I figured I might as well play it a little bit safe. I trimmed up both edges on the miter saw, and again I put myself in another finger removal situation with this riskier cut, but my fingers managed to live to see another day. I decided to go with a smaller size chamfer on all the edges. So I mentioned earlier I wanted to make the most epic mallet ever created by man, and a plain mallet head was not going to get me to hold that title. So here's where I decided to add a little bit of spice to this build. I wanted to do some sort of inlay on the mallet head, and I found this Celtic knot design that I thought would look really cool on the side. Now, I don't have a CNC router, but I thought possibly my laser engraver could engrave a deep enough groove to allow me to get some epoxy in there. And it didn't take long until I made my first mistake with this. I walked away for a little bit and came back to this. Not exactly what I was going for, and after some further investigation, I think the laser started to slide around a little bit when it was making faster movements. So I used my belt sander to get rid of the messed up engraving, and luckily, after I sanded it all away, you really couldn't even tell it was ever there in the first place. So I did what I should have done before I started and clamped the laser engraver down to my workbench, or at least kind of attempted to. I made sure to test it out and then restarted the engraving, and this time it actually came out perfect. It was just deep enough that I think it was going to work out. Now, there was a little bit of soot or kind of burnt wood that I had to clean out of the engraving, so it didn't mix with the epoxy I was using. It also helped to make that gap a little bit deeper to accept the inlay. So like I said, I am using epoxy again. And if you've watched any of my previous videos, I've said I've become less and less of an epoxy enthusiast over time. And that's mainly because I feel like people are getting less and less creative with it. So when I use epoxy, I like to try to at least do something somewhat new or creative. So I found this brass dust that I thought would make for a really cool inlay along with the ebony. I know I'm not the first person to use brass epoxy, but I still thought this was a creative way to include it into my project. My goal is to completely fill the engravings with the epoxy and sand it away to hopefully be left with that design in the mallet head. The thing I didn't realize about using this brass dust is that you need a huge scoop of it, probably way more than you think you would need to properly pigment the epoxy. This is because it seems to slowly sink to the bottom as it's curing, since it's a little bit heavier than the epoxy. Once the epoxy was cured though, I hit it with the oscillating sander. I tried to be as careful as I possibly could to not sand away the inlay. I even made sure to check every few seconds that I didn't sand through it, but of course I wasn't careful enough and I ended up sanding through one of the corners. It probably could have been just let go, but I wasn't going to let the most epic mallet have a dumb little defect like that, so I tried it again. Try again, I did, but this time I engraved it upside down. I've lost count of how many dumb mistakes I've made at this point, but hey, people like to see mistakes, so I hope my pain makes you feel a little bit better. Anyways, it's time to move on to the handle. This is another type of ebony wood with a much less original name. The species is called black and white ebony. I mean, they could have at least called it like zebra ebony or like Damascus ebony or some kind of cool word or name like that, but they clearly put no thought into the name. And the funny thing is, the white part in the ebony isn't really even white, it's like yellow. Jeez, just another thing for me to complain about. On a more serious note, I did pick up this species because I thought it would be a good match with the brass inlay I decided to do. So here I'm making the part of the handle that will fit into the head of the mallet. Since my bandsaw makes about as straight as a cut as a 2x4 from Home Depot, I had to do a decent amount of extra cleanup with my chisel. This was nice since I do always love doing some chisel work, as it just kind of makes me better and it's pretty satisfying. I thought it was kind of funny that I'm using my old mallet to make its replacement. It's kind of like a software engineer writing code for a program that can teach itself how to write code. It's got to be like cannibalism or something. Once I get that part all cleaned up, I needed to establish the shoulder of the handle so the head fits snugly and there is a smooth transition between the two. This type of ebony is pretty hard and dense too, so even though my chisels were sharp, it did take a bit longer than it normally would have. I've always wanted to try the thing where you hold the hammer upside down and hit the handle into place, and I've seen a bunch of people do this like with an axe and an axe handle, and it actually worked. And I have to admit, I did this way more than once because of how satisfying and fun it is to do. Once I'm done messing around with that, I wanted to shape the handle to fit nicely in my hand. I made a small template out of some scrap plywood and traced it out on the block. Then I just headed over to the bandsaw and could go ahead and cut it out. I probably could have just sanded it up to the line with the oscillating sander after I cut it out on the bandsaw, but I wanted a good clean baseline for the rest of the handle shaping I was planning to do. I attached the template I made with the trusty CA glue and blue tape method, and then used a small template bit to make an exact copy of that handle profile I was after. I've been using this little template bit a ton in my most recent project, so if you're looking to pick one up alongside of all the other tools I like to use, I'll have a link down in the description of everything I would recommend. Once I have the rough shape of the handle, I wanted to add another little brass accent to match the mallet head. I had this 1-inch piece of brass laying around for a good while, and I figured it would be perfect for what I was looking for. The only problem was it wasn't quite wide enough to fit around the handle, so I was going to have to cut it into 2 separate pieces and then glue it around the handle. Now, I am pretty much a complete idiot when it comes to working with any type of metal, so this is more of an experiment for me. Luckily, brass is a soft enough metal that I can still use all my woodworking tools and not have to go out and buy new metalworking tools, so I can shape this pretty easily. One thing I didn't know is how hot the metal gets. When I was making those cuts on the bandsaws, those suckers got hot on my hands, so I had to make multiple passes until I got what I needed. Now, I'm making 2 of these U-shaped pieces that will kind of wrap around the handle to make a brass band. Once I have the brass pieces roughly shaped, I'm going to mix up some 5-minute epoxy to attach them to the handle. Now, I have to say, a lot of these steps that I'm doing to build this mallet are completely unnecessary, and if you're planning to build a simple mallet, you could probably crank one out of maple in like less than an hour and call it a day. But I enjoy getting creative and wasting my time on extra steps, so I turned a 30-minute project into like a 30-hour project. Was it worth it? I'm not really sure. I guess you'll just have to tell me at the end once you see the final product. Anyways, I needed to make sure there would be no gaps when gluing up the brass, so I got as many clamps on as I could possibly, and the only gaps I was really worried about were where the 2 brass pieces met together. I feel like that would be the most notable area if there was a gap, so I made sure to clamp that area as tight as possible. Now, to flush up the pieces, I used my sander again, and remember what I said about brass getting hot? Yeah, well, it melted the epoxy bond, so I had to get it re-glued up, and you can see how hot that brass really is. When I sprayed a little bit of water on it, it actually started smoking. Luckily, this was an easy fix and didn't take too much time since the epoxy cures pretty fast. This time I made sure to sand much more slowly to allow for the heat to dissipate and not melt the epoxy again. I also began to shape the handle a little bit more on the sander as well. Once I got a decent chunk sanded down, I attached it to my workbench and got to work with my files. I wasn't really going for any specific look, just kind of one that would fit in my hand comfortably. I wasn't really seeming to make much progress with the files, so I switched over to my sander, and that seemed to eat away much more material with a lot less elbow grease. At this point, this mallet was really starting to look like something, and I could have called it done here, but I wanted to get a really nice sheen on the entire mallet. So I began to sand all the pieces. I hand sanded every inch, including the brass ring from 80 grit all the way up to like 7,000 grit, which was a bit overkill, but since these woods are so dense, it allows me to get a high polish when you sand up that high. Once my hand was getting ready to fall off, I caught it quits and got some automotive buffing compound to really make that brass ring shine. This was a pretty easy process. I just used a cloth shop rag and got it buffed up. After that, I still had a bit of sanding left to do on the mallet head. I wanted to try and get that brass inlay to shine a bit more to kind of match the brass in the handle. Now, in woodworking, it's important to try to work out the best order of operation before you build your project. You never want to put your jeans on before you put your socks on, unless you're just weird like that. But that's exactly what I did here. I still needed to cut the slots for the wedges on the handle, but everything was already sanded up to such a high grit and I didn't want to scratch anything, so I wrapped a towel around the handle to prevent that. For my bandsaw, slow and steady wins the race, so I kept her slow and steady. I swear I complain about this poor tool in every video I make, so this has to be the next thing I upgrade. But anyways, to make the wedges, I got some scrap pieces of ebony and tried to stay as straight as possible to make the wedges pretty thin. Once they were cut, I mixed up some more 5-minute epoxy since I'm impatient and could go ahead and hit the wedges home to lock the mallet head in place. Now I only really had one try at this, so I couldn't mess up. There's a fine line between how deep you hit the wedges in. If you hit them in too far, you can actually crack the mallet head, which is exactly what I did on the first mallet I did. Luckily for this mallet, there were no cracks in sight. After that dried, I trimmed the extra stuff off the mallet head and sanded it flush. I had to go back and resand the top to a high grit again, which was kind of annoying, but it was really my fault. So for the finish, I used everyone's favorite Rubio Monocoat, and that really brought that deep ebony color out in this mallet. After that, this thing is all finished up. Now, when I make cutting boards for people, sometimes they'll say it's too nice to use and they'd never want to bring a knife near it. I think after this mallet, I get where they're coming from. So let me know, should I actually use this thing or just kind of keep it as a decoration? Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed and maybe consider subscribing since you made it to the end of the video. Anyways, I will see you all in the next one.